repudiate the doctrine. That was undeniably the case in Darwin's day. It is undeniably the case today. Evolutionism has been surmounted over and over and over again by strong arguments. It was so at the very beginning. It has been refuted along the way. There are incredible arguments against it in our day, and yet people still maintain it. Evolution can still not explain the mechanism of evolution. Evolution can still not explain the taxonomic gaps in the fossil record. Evolution cannot avoid contradiction with known principles of genetics. Evolution cannot explain the appearance of matter or the eternality of matter. It cannot explain the emergence of life. It cannot explain the emergence of self-conscious intelligence. It cannot explain the emergence of morality. The modern evolutionist is just as gratuitous in his commitments as was the evolutionist in the days of Darwin and Huxley. And I give you as my prime example Theodosius Dobzhansky. Dobzhansky claims to be able to explain evolution, and I quote him, "If the assumption is made that life arose from matter only once." That's kind of like saying, I can raise $1 million if you just give me $1 million to start with. I can make evolution explain the origin of life if the assumption is made that life arose from matter only once. Kind of get me going here, and then we can explain everything after that. This is a modern evolutionist. He's one of the best known of the bunch. In the current edition of The Origin of Species, Dr. Thompson writes, and I quote, "Personal convictions are presented as if they were proofs. Scientists still recognize the inalienable flaws of the theory." And this is a great quote. Paul Westermeyer says, and I quote, "Evolution is useful, but it is a myth." We keep following it because it's useful to us, but it's a myth. Evolution continues to be propagated despite its problems. Perhaps the presuppositional status of the evolutionary theory is nowhere quite as obvious as in the writings of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He says that even if all the specific content of the evolutionary explanation of life were to be demolished, evolution would still have to be taken as our fundamental vision. And so he says, the defenders of evolution, I'm going to quote him, get a load of this. "Defenders of evolution must never let themselves be deflected into secondary discussions of the scientific hows and the metaphysical whys." We're not going to be bogged down in answering questions scientifically, how did it happen? Or in terms of the nature of reality, why did it happen? We mustn't be bogged down with that. Evolution, you see, has now assumed the unassailable, authoritative, what we would call logically primitive standard of truth for the scientist. And so, I might quote, "Evolution has long since ceased to be a hypothesis and has become a general epistemological condition, which must henceforth be satisfied by every hypothesis." This has become a God that lays down a law that says, you dare not have any other gods in my presence. You dare not make up your own ideas or even test my existence. Every hypothesis must now be tested by this standard. Is it evolutionary or not? So says Desjardins. To which you will say, and who gives you the right to dictate that? And so W.T. Jones, the philosopher earlier quoted, says, "The scientists have now elevated Darwinism to the level of a religious dogma." This is not a Christian that writes this. This is just the man who knows the history of thought. And he says Darwinism is now treated like it's a religious dogma. And Thompson, the one who writes the introduction to The Origin of Species, concurs, saying the concept of organic evolution was an object of genuinely religious devotion. And so, is evolution scientific? It wasn't scientific to begin with, it was philosophical. Is evolution scientific in the way that it is defended? No, it's not defended that way. It's made a precondition for anything to count as science. Is evolution non-religious and neutral? No. In fact, it is a religious presupposition that's held to tenaciously, even in the face of contrary evidence. Even when a man has to say, well, just give me life from matter once, and then I can make the theory work. Now, evolutionism, you see, was the spirit of Darwin's day, and it's the spirit of our day as well. It arises not from the scientific explanation of the world or even the observational approach to the facts. It arises from the hearts of men who are looking for a way to avoid their creator. Darwinism merely gives this philosophical presupposition a veneer of scientific respectability. The theory was refuted by leading scientists of his day, but men held on to it with all of their lives, like it was a religious faith. But something further needs to be said about evolutionary theory beyond its speculative origin and its presuppositional tenacity. That is the way in which people hold on to it. Evolution is now being held and defended not just presuppositionally, but it's being treated as a dogma in the scientific community or in the scientific guild. I'll give you an example of that. 1959, Julian Huxley, who is a great-great-grandson of T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. Julian Huxley wrote, I still can't believe that anybody would have the audacity, he wrote, quote, "The evolution of life is no longer a theory, it is a fact." And so dedicated evolutionists, you might not be surprised to find, are very intolerant of those who disagree with them. They are as intolerant, if not worse, than those religious fundamentalists that they like to ridicule. Those who question the sacred cow of evolution are coincidentally in graduate school blocked from admission or success in their studies. If they happen to have already gotten a job, they are not invited to present papers at colloquiums. Their books are not reviewed, and they are not hired in the major universities of our land. What a coincidence, huh? Scientific evidence contrary to evolution may not be taught, and alternative theories of man's origin may not be presented in most public schools in our land. In the state of California, where I come from, if you try to teach an alternative theory of man's origin, you'll be fired. It's forbidden. Well, what happened to this open-minded, we're all just out there looking for the truth attitude? You see, as soon as we got rid of those bigoted religious fundamentalists and their creationist views so we could open up everything to impartial investigation of the facts, lo and behold, a new bigotry took over. The bigotry that says nobody will be allowed to contradict the reigning dogma of evolution. In 1881, the British Natural History Museum presented an exhibit on Darwin's theory of evolution. And in the exhibit, in the explanatory cards that are there for the exhibit, we read that the theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, is, quote, one possible explanation. One possible explanation. And it admitted that the concept of natural selection, quote, is not strictly scientific. That's because it's not empirically demonstrated, not demonstrated by observational evidence. This exhibit that said only that much, again, one possible explanation, not strictly scientific, this exhibit caused such uproar, so much anger arose because of it. And there was such political pressure that the museum removed any acknowledgement of problems in the theory of Darwin. Political pressure was put on, so they wouldn't even say something like this is one possible theory. You see, what we have in the case of evolution, if I can stand back, and again, I'm just coming as an ignorant philosopher looking at the history of thought, what you have here is not science, you have sociology. This is the sociology of knowledge, the way in which people interact with one another and impose views on each other. In his 1991 book, Darwin on Trial, Philip Johnson, who is a lawyer, writes these interesting words, quote, "What first drew my attention to the question was the way the rules of argument seemed to be structured to make it impossible to question whether evolution is really true." He said, that's what got me thinking. Why is it that the rules are always bent and guided in such a way that you're not allowed to even ask questions about this? Evolution is now propounded as a bigoted religious dogma, and it is not empirical in its nature. It is not something that men hold to because they have observational evidence. In his 1985 book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, Michael Denton writes, and I quote, "There can be no question that Darwin had nothing like sufficient evidence to establish his theory of evolution." When Darwin wrote, "No speciation and no evolution was directly observed in the natural order." When he wrote, there was no direct evidence that natural selection had ever caused any biological change. Darwin himself said that the infinitude of connecting links in the natural order was crucial to his theory of evolution, and went on to admit he was unable to demonstrate even one. Everything the theory called for to be credible from a scientific standpoint was missing, down to the point that when Darwin explained natural selection, he said, "Let me beg my reader to offer a couple of hypothetical examples." Does that sound like science to you? Let me give you a couple of hypothetical examples of how we cure polio. It's not scientific. Darwin had a vision. He had a perspective. He had a presupposition. He had a philosophy. And the best he could do is show hypothetically how it might work. In 1874, Professor J. Tyndall wrote, quote, "The basis of the doctrine of evolution consists not in an experimental demonstration, for the subject is hardly accessible to this mode of proof, but in its general harmony with scientific thought. We claim and shall wrest from theology the entire domain of cosmological theory." He said, no, we don't have observational evidence, but we're not going to let the theologians tell us where the world came from anymore. You see, the theory of evolution is in its nature now basically a matter of historical reconstruction. It's an attempt to reconstruct the history of where man came from or where species come from. And in the nature of the case, that's impossible to experimentally verify by observation. You ever stop and think about this? Evolution cannot be demonstrated scientifically because we can't go back and watch the evolution of the species. And moreover, we can't even watch the alleged evolution of any species that are now coming about because it takes such long periods of time. No one lives long enough to test it. It's not in the nature of the case something subject to empirical validation. It must always remain somewhat speculative. So now listen to this quote by Stephen Jay Gould, one of the leading campaigners for evolution in our culture today. He wrote in the journal Paleobiology for 1977, "The general preference that so many of us hold for gradualism is a metaphysical stance." Metaphysics is a division of philosophy, the division of philosophy that studies the nature, origin, and structure of reality. And so for our tonight, I'll just reread that with the word philosophical in there to make the point. "The general preference that so many of us hold for gradualism is a philosophical stance embedded in the history of Western cultures. It is not a high-order empirical observation induced from the objective study of nature." This man goes around and testifies in court cases against people who want equal treatment of evolution and creation in the classroom, to say that it's unscientific to teach a creationist view of man as one possibility. And yet he admits himself that evolution is philosophical in nature, not observational, not scientifically, if you will, grounded. But the worst is yet to come. I think I have pretty much discounted the idea that we're dealing with a scientific theory, but it turns out, I told you earlier, that when philosophers turned to investigate the theory of evolution as a theory, what was found out, to the embarrassment of the dogmatists of our day, is that the theory of evolution doesn't count as a scientific theory at all. Let me see if I can work this through for you before we take our break. You look out at the world and you find an amazing, a remarkable diversity of living things, don't you? You see out there tigers, and you see whales and goats. You see eagles and carrots and cockroaches and roses and roosters, and you see grapes and giraffes and gorillas and germs, and on it goes. Just amazing, the diversity of living things that are out there. Now, how did such a profuse variety of species come about? Well, as I've already told you, the evolutionary idea is that they came about naturally by means of a gradual transformation from simpler forms, each having its place in a complex but common genetic tree, stemming from a primordial blob of life, then developing outward. And Charles Darwin says this is where species come from. The idea carried no scientific credibility until Darwin. And the reason why Darwin gave it scientific credibility is because he, for once, offered a mechanism, allegedly, a mechanism for this evolutionary transformation from the initial blob to all the germs, giraffes, and gorillas of this world. How did it happen? It's caught very nicely in the title of his 1859 book. Let me give it to you now, its long version. We call it The Origin of Species. That's an abbreviation. The title of the book was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. It says it very nicely. Once again, on the origin of species. Where did giraffes and germs and gorillas come from? The origin of those species differences in the animal world. On the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Darwin said, given the competition for preservation or existence in this world, those types of organisms which are most fit, those which are best adapted to the environment, will be the ones that survive to propagate their kind. The less fit will over time be replaced by the more fit through this process that he called natural selection. And so natural selection is supposed to cause genetically advantaged organisms to survive better than the less advantaged organisms, and thus to evolve into more advanced organisms over time. And this mechanism is supposed to be inherent in the natural world itself, something of a built-in drive toward adaptation and improvement. You understand what the theory is? What's the problem with it? Let's see if we can slay it with one philosophical stroke. Whenever a theory, I'm just talking about theory development, any philosopher will tell you the same thing. Anytime you develop a theory that relates one class of things to another class of things, either relates by identity, by causation, by subclass, by left-right, relationship's not important. But when you say this class of things is related to this class of things in the following way, the only way you can test that theory is if you can identify class A independently of class B. Have I lost you here? What if I say that all of the best basketball players in the world are Danish? I don't know why I would say that with a name like Bonson, but it just kind of popped into my head once. Now then, if I'm going to say all the best basketball players in the world are Danish, the only way I can test that is by finding the best basketball players as a class and finding out if each and every one of them turns out to be from known as Danish people. Isn't that right? What if I do it this way? What if every time you bring me one of the best basketball players in the world, I say, oh, well, then he's Danish. You say, well, no, wait a minute. How do you know? You've got to find out that he's Danish before. No. He's Danish because my theory says all the best basketball players are Danish. You say, no. You've got to independently prove that this person's Danish, and then independently prove that he's one of the best basketball players in the world. You can't just go from he's Danish to he's a great player, or from he's a great player to he's Danish. It's not a scientifically testable hypothesis unless you can independently establish the classes that are being related. Now, do you understand what I'm getting at? Let's go back and look at evolution. Darwin said that the fittest organisms will survive. But Darwin's theory had no independent criteria for fitness. There was no independent way to say which are the most fit organisms or animals, if you want to. Let's just talk about animals here. There's no independent way to identify the fittest animals apart from what? Looking at which animals survive. And thus, it's not a testable theory in any scientific sense. It's only what we call a trivial verbal truth. That is, you are just repeating your commitment to the idea that the fittest are going to survive. So whenever I bring you a survivor, you say, well, that's because it was the fittest. Now, some people will balk at that. They'll say, no, scientists have independent criteria for fitness. And it is true that if you get into this in detail, many of you tonight won't, some of you might, when you get into it, you'll find that some people have tried to have independent criteria for fitness. They've all failed. And they always will fail in the nature of the case. It's not because I'm a prophet that I predict that. Anybody who knows the nature of theory formation knows that must fail. And I'll show you why. Here is an independent criteria for fitness. Let's say we're studying a pack of wolves, or various kinds of wolves, and we want to decide which is the most fit, which we could predict would survive. And we find that this one particular kind of wolf has highly developed back quarters, has strong back legs. Okay? Almost in a mutant sense, has much larger back leg muscles than the other types of wolves. And then the reasoning goes like this. Such a wolf will be faster than the other kinds of wolves. That means that, generally speaking, such a wolf will make it to the kill faster than the others. And so if any wolves die out from starvation, it will be those that are the slower, less fully developed hindquarter wolves. Looks like a pretty good scientific theory. You can test it and so forth. Until you remember that living organisms are highly developed and interdependent biological organisms, and that the hindquarters of the developed wolf might put such a strain on its heart that it causes it to have a heart attack. Which happens when you get some animal mutations and human mutations put such a strain on the lungs, the heart, or other vital organs that advantage proves to be deadly. We know that happens. And so now how are we going to know whether the wolf with the highly developed hindquarters is more fit or less fit than the competing types of wolves in the world? It's all going to depend on whether he survives. And so we're right back to the survival of the fittest, which means the survival of the survivors. Darwin did not offer the world a scientific theory, my friends. Although, the smoke and mirrors game has been used in our secular universities for over a century, this was never a scientific theory. It was always a perspective of philosophy that was imposed in advance on the facts, rather than something that arose from or could be tested by the facts. And so let me quote T.H. Morgan, who won the Nobel Prize for chromosome mapping of the fruit fly. Yeah, that's not the sort of thing you want to do, but he's a very smart man. And he said, and I quote, "It may appear little more than a truism to state that the individuals that are best adapted to survive have a better chance of surviving than those not so well adapted to survive." Yeah, it might appear a little more than a truism, that's for sure. The prominent geneticist C.H. Waddington said, "Natural selection, which was at first considered as though it were a hypothesis that was in need of experimental or observational confirmation, turns out on closer inspection to be a tautology, a logical truism, a statement of an inevitable, although previously unrecognized relation. It states that the fittest individuals in a population, defined as those which leave the most offspring, will leave the most offspring." And so it might not surprise you, although it ought to anger you, that Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection has been quietly abandoned in the universities of our land. It's been quietly abandoned, or if the terminology is still used, it's redefined. And that galls me. Because you see, I know better. You see, I've done my homework, and I know what's going on out there, and yet this idea that, well, we all believe in evolution and, so forth and so on. The fact is, no one defends Darwinian natural selection. No one. What is now called natural selection, as you find it, for instance, in R.A. Fisher's book, The Genetical Theory of Selection, amounts to the theory of differential reproduction. Differential reproduction is just the view that some organisms have more offspring than others. Some organisms produce more babies than other organisms. Ernst Mayr in 1963 wrote, quote, "Those individuals that have the most offspring are by definition the fittest ones." R.C. Lewontin, professor of zoology at Harvard, wrote in 1974, "The Genetic Basis of Evolutionary Change." In the latest evolutionary theories, he says, quote, "Natural selection plays no role at all." Natural selection no longer explains how we came to have giraffes and germs and gorillas. It no longer explains how we get different species. It only explains how different species become more or less numerous. The question was supposed to be, how did they come into existence in the first place? And so Waddington concedes that, quote, "The whole real guts of evolution, which is how you come to have horses and tigers and things, is left behind in this neo-Darwinian theory of differential reproduction." Morgan observed, and I quote, "Selection then has not produced anything new, but only more of certain kinds of individuals. Evolution, however, means producing new things, not more of what already exists." So what I'm saying is the theory of evolution is not scientific, never was, is not, never will be. It is a philosophy. It's a way of looking at things. It does not arise from the evidence of our senses and observation of the world. It is not tested by our observations of the world, and it cannot be. One last thing, and then we'll take a break. Remember that one of the things scientists are going to do is get rid of teleological explanations, explanations that suggest that there's order or purpose or aim in what's going on in the world. We just want mechanistic explanations. And that was supposed to be one of the advantages of evolution. We get away from this idea of a personal creator guiding the development of the natural order, and now we just have mechanisms. You have the world itself going on blindly. Evolutionists present evolution as some kind of impersonal, mechanical, blind, and haphazard process in the physical world. But then when you read the evolutionists, you will see that they mislead themselves by attributing to the natural order a creative role. Evolutionists will explain their theories by means of analogies to animal breeders. Well, that's a false analogy, isn't it? You see, to say nature works like the breeder of a rose or of a particular kind of sheep or dog is to assume that nature has personal qualities like the breeders do. It is true that breeders sort out qualities and they purposely try to develop a superior species or whatever they want, they think it's going to sell. But nature is not a person, is it? And so the analogy to a breeder is very misleading. And then you read also of metaphors that the evolutionists will use for natural selection. What they end up doing is personifying and reifying, making into a separate substance or person, nature as a whole. They'll speak of nature like a composer, or nature like a sculptor, or a poet, or a playwright. These are all taken from the words of evolutionists. Gee, that's as silly as that commercial. Do you remember this long ago? It's not right to fool Mother Nature. There is no Mother Nature that acts like a composer, a poet, a sculptor, a playwright. And yet when evolutionists try to explain their theory, they always make the natural order into a kind of person. They personify. And so an alleged purposeless natural process gets treated as though it were something that has intelligence and design and personality. Well, I told you that I was going to drive because, you see, I'm very hot under the collar about this. This idea that you Christians, you follow faith. We follow the facts. You're religious. We're scientific. And by scientific, they're supposed to be naturalistic, impersonalistic, non-teleological. They're supposed to be without religious prejudices, observational and not speculative. They're supposed to give theories that are not dogmatically held but testable. And on every point, I find them wanting. The nature of the theory of evolution, whatever you want to make it out to be, philosophical, religious, personal, speculative, whatever you want to call it, it is certainly not scientific. Now, if you come back for my second lecture tonight, I will try to convince you that theistic evolution ain't going to help.
This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute. Duplication, sharing, and distribution is encouraged. For more information about the life and ministry of Dr. Greg L. Bahnsen, visit our website, bahnseninstitute.com, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
I'd like to quote from the 1972 book, "Can something come from nothing? There's no field of thought where it's considered rational to think so. And yet in evolution, you must believe that at some point there was nothing. But that's only the first major blind leap of faith that is required if you're going to be an evolutionist. The second is this. Now that we have something, we don't know where it came from or how, but now that we have something, order came from disorder. This something, which is just random, now is no longer random, but is orderly. Once there was nothing, then there was something. Once there was disorder and randomness, and now we have order. Again, you don't have to be an expert in the natural sciences to look at the theory of evolution and to see the problems that it has. How can order come from disorder? You have the very opposite of a quality arising from the quality itself. But isn't that another version of something coming from nothing? Once there was no order, nothing order, and then there was something order. And so at the beginning, there's nothing out there, but then there's something. At the beginning, there's no order, but then there's order. But there's a third leap of faith necessary, and that's that this orderly, inorganic matter somehow had life spring from it. Do you remember what I quoted from Dostoevsky last hour? Just a grant that life came from matter once, and I can explain by means of evolution everything else. Well, yeah, but that's a tall order, isn't it? Does life come from nothing? That's contrary to what we know about the natural world. We don't believe in spontaneous generation anymore after Pasteur. You know that? It's considered a sign of ignorance to think that maggots just spontaneously arise from rotting meat. And yet the evolutionist believes something that preposterous on an order, what do you think, 1,000, 1,000,000 times greater? He says that life itself sprang from inorganic matter. But that's not the only leap of faith the evolutionist must accomplish. Fourthly, he must believe that variation arose from the same identical factors. Let's see if I can put this together in kind of cartoon strip style. Once there was a blob of living whatever. Now, what acted upon this blob? Well, I don't know, but let's just say they are factors X, Y, and Z. Now, if factors X, Y, and Z acted upon the blob, then everything that's in the blob had X, Y, and Z factored into it. But somewhere along the line, the evolutionist says the blob is no longer a blob. It's canaries and rabbits and bacteria. The blob goes a lot of different ways. But you see, in the original condition of things, all the factors were the same. But in the output of things, you have variation. And what I want to know is, where do you get from common factors to varied consequence? That's utterly unscientific to reason that way. If all the factors are the same in the primordial blob, nothing's going to change in the primordial blob, or if it does, it's all going to change. That's one of the laws of science, you know. We reason by means of types. The same type of thing happens when anything has the same type of factor brought to bear on it. And so evolution requires 4 leaps of faith. Something came from nothing. Order came from disorder. Life sprang from inorganic matter. Variation arose from identical factors. But it requires another leap of faith, and that's that at some point along the line, I don't know how the blob got to a humanoid form, as contrast to a canary or a giraffe, but somehow it got there. And once it got there, intelligence sprang from non-intelligence. You had things which have no self-consciousness or what we would call intelligence, the ability to reason from A to B to C. And now you've got a creature that has that ability to reason. Now, how's that possible? I'll listen to the behaviorists today. They'll tell you it's stimulus response, right? Well, what were the stimuli that made the humanoid respond that way? I'd like you to make this story credible for me. Besides, if it's only stimulus response, then there's never any creativity. You realize that? The behaviorist theory of man can't account for creativity. The behaviorist theory of language, let's just take that for a moment, says that children are in a proper stimulated condition and learn to utter a word, let's say ball, okay? And so that whenever they are stimulated in that way from now on, they know to utter ball. Okay, the stimulus is supposed to be, of course, to bring a round, rubber, red object or something into their sight and touch, whatever. Okay, so whenever they are stimulated upon in the red, round, rubber way, then they know how to say ball. Okay? But you see, children do more than just look at objects. And although it is kind of humorous to see children acting like they know so much and they go ball, shoe. Children use sentences. But now on the theory, the behaviorist theory of language, children should learn sentences in the same way that they learn to use single words. So, Mama, I want my bottle is the sentence that is used under the stimulus condition of hunger in the stomach. You see someone that under the right stimulus looks like your mother, and so forth and so on. So you use the sentence, Mama, I want my bottle. But here's the amazing thing about children. I love them. They refute behaviorism so easily. Sometimes, without you ever teaching a child a sentence, the child gets creative and says, Mama, I want my ball. How did the child do that? On the behaviorist theory, it's stimulus response. Stimulus, which is to say the responses are all to set stimuli conditions. A set of common factors leads to the same response. Where do children ever learn to use language if behaviorism is true? Now, language is just one part of the problem. Self-consciousness is even more technical a subject and difficult in philosophy than is how we learn to use language. How did something which had no intelligence, no language, all of a sudden start using, well, all of a sudden, over billions of years, learn to use language and to become self-conscious? This is just amazing. And remember, as Jacques Simonad says, pure chance is at the root of evolution. We get no hope and help from a creator. No free rides. It's got to be chance, and chance alone that does it. Something from nothing, order from disorder, life from inorganic matter, variation from identical factors, intelligence from non-intelligence, self-consciousness from non-consciousness, language from inarticulate animation, and finally, morality from what is non-moral. If evolution were true, why did humanoids that somehow got language and self-consciousness, why did they ever start making what we call moral judgments? Not just judgments about what is the case. I am hungry. I am thirsty. The sun is hot. Where did we come up with the concept of you ought not to go to bed with your neighbor's wife? Okay, forget, what the issue is, whether it's sex, property, whatever. Where does the ought not come from? Where does the humanoid that learns now to use language and has self-consciousness come up with the ought or ought not in his thinking, or her thinking, for that matter. You see what I'm getting at? Evolution requires incredible faith. Over against the faith of the evolutionist, I feel like an absolute rationalist as a Christian. I look at this world, and the only way I can account for it is I say there's an intelligent God that made it all and so forth. Oh, boy, we can outdo that. We don't have a God. We don't have anything out there. Something came from nothing. This came from non-intelligence. Morality came from the non-moral. Now, of course, I'm playing the part of the evolutionist and putting these words in his mouth. Evolutionists don't ever come out and tell their classes that, though, do they? They don't come out and say, well, I'm really kind of embarrassed to tell you this, but I have a real, religious faith that has got me going this morning. I believe order came from disorder, and life sprang from non-life. But now that we got that started, I'd like to now teach you about biology and zoology and all the rest. They never admit that. And yet they have the audacity to ridicule our brothers and sisters in the Lord when they say, well, I just don't have as much faith as you. I've got to believe there's a God who does all those things. Second problem with evolution, why it needs to be saved. There are tremendous scientific difficulties with the theory of evolution. And I'll begin illustrating that by asking you this question. What advantage or function is there to a partially developed sex organ? Yeah, that's right. When you're a debater, you learn to go for the jugular. You're going to embarrass the theory, embarrass it bad. Okay, allegedly, you have small incremental changes in an organism, right? Develops, a little change here, a little change there, no major thing. What I want to, I'm not even sure I can say it. What I want to know is what a partially developed genitalia does for you. Can you propagate the race that way? No. Your chances of survival, if you mean by that having offspring, are pretty, dismal. It certainly isn't advantageous from the standpoint that it gives some kind of gratification or sensual pleasure. How does the evolutionist account for the evolution of our sex organs? Oh, there's a bigger problem than that if you think about it. This is an amazing miracle that at one point organisms multiplied by cell division. All right? You start in the primordial soup, okay, in which the lightning struck, I don't know where the lightning came from, but primordial soup, the lightning, and then life begins. If you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. But we believe this, and now there's life. But the life, of course, is amoeba-like life. I mean, not a whole lot of interest here, not well developed. And these amoebas, or whatever they are, how do they propagate? Through cell division. You've all had high school biology, you know this, right? Okay, now let's go to the end of the line here. After billions and billions of years, now you've got a boy and a girl, and they propagate by making babies the way you know babies are made. Okay, let's call that copulation. Over here we have cell division. Over here we have copulation. I'd like an explanation of what goes on in between. How do we get from cell division to genital organs, and beyond that, how do we get boys and girls? Have you ever thought about that? How does the evolutionist explain that? Why didn't the humanoids that all develop as girls? How did we get boy humanoids and girl humanoids? But it's worse than that. How did the boys and the girls know what to do to make a baby? Okay, let's say you can surmount all of those easy questions. I've got one last question for you. Doesn't it require incredible faith to believe that the human race could have survived in this way? Because here's what it amounts to. We all know that the period of a female humanoid's fertility is limited. Okay? When a baby girl is born, she can't have another baby, 10 seconds or 9 months later, right? Okay? In fact, she can't a year later. I mean, I'm just giving you the facts of biology here. How old does a girl have to be before she becomes fertile? Well, let's generalize. Let's say 13. Okay. If I'm off on that, forgive me, okay? I'm going to say 13. Now, for how long can a woman bear a child? Till she dies? If she lives to be 500 years old, she can have children till she's 500, 400, 300. Let's go down to our generation. 100, 90, 80, 70. You know the answer. It's no. Because there is this thing with menopause. So that she stops being able to bear children. So now, if we say that our specimen at 13 can start having children, that she's capable. And if we say that our specimen at, I don't want to scare anybody, let's say 63, can no longer have children, then what do we have here? 50 years? Did I do my math right? We'll ask Randy. Is that right? 50 years. But you see, because I'm a generous kind of guy, when I debate people, I want to make it easy on them. I'm going to double it. I'm going to say the period of female fertility for this one individual organism is 100 years. Now let's go back and look at the big picture. You have to remember that evolution took place over billions of years. Let's make it easy. Millions of years. Millions of years. And if millions of years is from that wall to that wall, do you know how wide 100 years on the timeline is? Even I can't see it. It's that wide. I just want to give you something to think about here. And now, how likely is this? In the millions of years of chance development of organisms, somehow, during the same infinitesimal slice of 100 years, you got a boy organism and a girl organism, and they made a baby. You believe that? That's preposterous. Evolution cannot account for sex, differentiation, or even the history of moving from cell division to copulation as the method. Well, there's other problems. What advantage or function is a partially developed eye? You ever thought about the amazing miracle of the human eye? How does the evolutionist account for the evolution of the eye? Do you think a partially evolved eye is helpful? Does this make it more fit for survival? A partially developed eye doesn't do anything for you. But here's how the evolutionist explains it. Okay, I've read this. This is fascinating. According to the evolutionary account, light sensitivity cells at some point became a receptor organ. You read that sentence and you say, could you come again? Light sensitivity cells became a receptor organ. Why did the cell, first of all, why are some cells light sensitive and others aren't? Don't know. But somehow the cells that are light sensitive, I guess they traveled, got together. Kind of like in Terminator 2, so this thing kind of blobs together. And then we got an organ that's light sensitive. Well, that's amazing. But then the organ becomes a cup-like depression. Why? It just does. And then the cup-like depression acquires focusing capacity. Of course, that assumes attendant unexplained muscle changes for the sake of focusing. And then the cup fills with a transparent matter that becomes a lens. At this point, it's still of no use to the organism. How many generations you have to go through, all these changes, we still haven't got anything that helps. But for some reason, light-sensitive cells getting together, making an organ, depressing, okay. And then focusing becomes imaging. That's the one that, as a philosopher, I love. Here you have an organ. It's cup-like, has muscles attached to it, and it can focus, okay? So it can open, close, open, close. And then the next step, without a word of explanation in the textbook says, and then it became a focusing mechanism. Focusing, how does it become an imaging organism? We don't know. Here's another problem. Why do people have two coordinated eyes? What was the evolutionary advantage of that? If there is, by the way, an advantage, why not three? Flies have quite a few. One eye would do it. And so we not only have to believe that you have cells that somehow get together, they're light sensitive, making an organ that gets depressed, that gets this lens in here that starts focusing, and then imaging. We have to believe that it happened twice. And all in the same part of the body, for that matter. That's great. 2 coordinated eyes. How did nerve connections develop to the brain? Because at this point, you have to remember, we haven't got any brain interpretation. We've only got light sensitivity and focusing. And we know very well that the human brain reverses or interprets a reversed image. What evolutionary advantage is there for this image being reversed and then the brain having to interpret it and turn it on? In fact, why, if evolution is true, is the visual cortex at the back of the brain, and yet that which receives the signals that go to the visual cortex situated on the front of the head? Why would it evolve that way? So that now you have to have nerves that go from the back of the eyeballs to the visual cortex. Does that seem efficient? Survival of the fittest to you? Oh, it gets worse than that. The right side of the visual cortex is associated by nerve connections with the left hand field of vision for both of the eyes. Talk about how confusing human visual biology is. The right side of the visual cortex, is associated by nerve connections with the left hand field of vision in both of the eyes. So the left hand field of vision, this over and this over, is controlled by the right side of the visual cortex in the brain, and vice versa. Now, I'm saying that is not the sort of thing you would expect that efficiency and the survival of the fittest would bring about. And moreover, if the reason why a mutant form of organism maintains a change is because it must be advantageous in the struggle for life, then I want an explanation of how this developing light sensitivity cells, organism, so forth, ever helped the organism until all the stuff was connected and plugged in and working. It takes incredible faith to be an evolutionist. It takes incredible faith that chance mutations created a series of small steps over vast periods of time and developed an interrelated, complicated organism that requires a heart and a lung and requires that they work simultaneously. I've already asked you, what good is half a genitalia? What good is half an eyeball? What good is half a heart? What good is half a lung? I can go you better. What good is a whole heart without a lung? How good is a whole lung without a heart? And we're supposed to believe on the theory of evolution that over a long period of time, chance mutations, not directed by God, just remember Jacques Monod, pure blind chance. Chance mutations made incremental, small step changes, and that you ended up with creatures, the vast majority of mammals, that have hearts and lungs that work simultaneously and require each other. Remove the lung, the heart dies. Remove the heart, the lung dies. How did that happen by chance? You see, we're not talking about we're looking for more discoveries to finally understand. We're looking at a theory which on its own internal logic is impossible. You can't have small changes when you need big organs working together, or else they don't work at all. Oh, and then there's also the embarrassment of the fossil record. You realize that evolutionists have not one piece of evidence in the fossil record for intermediate creatures. Many Christians, because we've been browbeat, I'm afraid, don't hear that. And I'm going to say it again. I am not saying that we as Christians have a body of evidence, and evolutionists have a body of evidence, and ours is bigger than theirs. I'm saying they have zero evidence in the fossil record. Zero. No intermediate forms, no missing links. So embarrassing is this that the leading archaeologist of our day, paleontologist, who is an evolutionist, has come up with a way to explain that. Stephen Jay Gould now propounds the theory of punctuated equilibrium. And what happens is evolution doesn't take place continuously and uniformly over long periods of time. It's punctuated. And so what you have is a period of time where there's a lot of evolutionary activity and change, boom, and then things level out. Thousands. And then boom, there's another period of evolutionary activity. Now again, that just adds one more thing back over here to all the faith leaps. Why should things, just go along nice and uniformly, then all of a sudden there are these evolutionary changes? Well, the advantage, you see, is that if the evolutionary changes take place in real short bursts of evolutionary energy, then it won't leave any fossil record. And so what you get in the fossil record is one type of creature, then long periods of uniformity, and then another type of creature, and you don't need intermediate forms anymore. Isn't that great? So you save your theory by building into it immunity from evidence. That's exactly what he has done. And yet, if we as Christians did that about any of the things we believed, we'd be laughed right out of the classroom. And here's a man who writes things in scholarly journals, and people go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Well, there's a problem with biochemistry as well. DNA research has made evolution utterly impossible. The development of life requires too many simultaneous things in terms of amino acid chains for evolution to be conceivable. I thought it'd be good to quote something here from Michael Denton's book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. This to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. He says, envisioning how a living cell could have gradually evolved through a sequence of simple protocells seems to pose almost insuperable problems. If the estimates above in his discussion previously are anywhere near the truth, then this would undoubtedly mean that the alternative scenario, the possibility of life arising suddenly on Earth by chance, is infinitely small. To get a cell by chance would require at least 100 functional proteins to appear simultaneously in one place. 100 simultaneously in one place. That is 100 simultaneous events, each of an independent probability, which could hardly be more than 10 to the minus 20th power. Each one of the 100 has its own probability. Y'all remember how to do this from school? 1 over 10 to the 20th. What does 10 to the 20th mean? How many zeros? 20 zeros. That's a big number. That's the likelihood of one. And you need 100 simultaneously appearing. 100. Giving a maximum combined probability of 10 to the minus 2,000. Recently, he goes on to say Hoyle and Wickman, I can't say this other guy's name, Hoyle, in Evolution from Space, their book entitled Evolution from Space, 1981, provided a similar estimate of the chance of life originating, assuming functional proteins to have a probability of 10 to the minus 20th power, 1 over 10 with 20 zeros. And now we quote from them. By itself, the small probability could be faced because one must contemplate not just a single shot at obtaining the enzyme, but a very large number of trials such as are supposed to have occurred in an organic soup early in the history of the Earth. The trouble is that there are about 2,000 enzymes, and the chance of obtaining them all in a random trial, that's the hypothesis. Remember Jacques Monod, pure chance. The trouble is that there are about 2,000 enzymes, and the chance of obtaining them all in a random trial is only 1 part in 10 to the 20th power factored by 2,000. That is to say, when you put all this together, the chance is 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. 1 chance, put a 10 there, and 40,000 zeros. That's the chance of life originating by chance with the enzymes that are necessary. And they call this an outrageously small probability that could not be faced even if the whole universe consisted of organic soup. And yet people believe this. Big Bang cosmology has become a real problem for the theory of evolution. Because Big Bang cosmology is challenged by discrepancies in recent astronomical findings. According to the Big Bang theory, regions that have higher density at the light flash point, that is, areas which under gravity formed matter clusters and galaxies at the point of the initial bang. Regions that have higher density at the light flash point should be detectable as slightly warmer than regions of the background radiation. Okay, the points of the flash should, even now, I mean, the universe carries its history astronomically. That's a theory that I don't have time to explain to you. Anyway, the background radiation, you see, should be slightly cooler than the flash points where matter came into existence. And the problem is the Cosmic Background Explorer satellite, which has been up there sending this embarrassing data back, sure uniformity of temperature throughout the universe. No point for the Big Bang. The background radiation is the same general temperature as the foreground clusters. Well, there are plenty of books that you can pursue. You didn't ask a philosopher to come in here and entertain you with all these things. You could look at Norman Macbeth's book written in 1971, Darwin Retried. Or you could consider the 1984 book by Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson, The Mystery of Life's Origin. Or the 1985 book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis by Michael Denton. Most recently, 1991 book by Philip Johnson, Darwin on Trial. And you will have your head full of the problems in the theory of evolution. Not the philosophical ones, by which it has already been utterly slain, but now the scientific ones that embarrass it. So now I'm going to ask you a question. Could these massive problems be taken care of? Could these massive problems be explained away if we came up with a religious version of evolutionary theory? You see, evolution has no mechanism, but if you bring God into the question, God then gives the mechanism. The theory of evolution requires a personification of the natural order, but if you bring God in, then you've got a person behind the natural order. The theory of evolution requires incredible leaps from nothing to something, disorder to order, but if you bring God into the equation, then all those leaps could be taken care of. All these gaps could be filled in. And so what about theistic evolution? Could theistic evolution save the theory of evolution? Let me give you an example. I just cited Philip Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial, from 1991, and I quote him. The concept of creation in itself does not imply opposition to evolution, if evolution means only a gradual process by which one kind of living creature changes into something else. A creator might well have employed such a gradual process as a means of creation. Evolution contradicts creation only when it is explicitly or tacitly defined as fully naturalistic evolution, meaning evolution not directed by any purposeful intelligence. So here's a man who knows fully well that evolution's in deep trouble, but he says it's only naturalistic evolution that's in deep trouble. You could have a religious version, a purposeful intelligence behind it all. And so we have the theory of theistic evolution. And it would be put this way. Man gradually, by slight degrees, evolved from lower animal forms over many years by a physical process which God providentially guided and in which he periodically intervened supernaturally. Once again, theistic evolution. I'm defining it for you. Man gradually, by slight degrees, evolved from lower animal forms over many years by a physical process which God providentially guided and in which he periodically intervened supernaturally. Now, you know that I would not have set you all up for this and brought you this far if I was going to say, Eureka! I've seen the light. That's the answer. I don't believe it is. And I have to explain to you before you go home tonight why. You see, this raises crucial questions. Let's forget all the talk about the evolution of eyeballs and all those other difficulties. I'm going to get out of the realm of science and just talk to you now. When people start talking about God, what is required? Because the theory of theistic evolution makes reference to God. What is required when we talk about God? This raises crucial questions of religious epistemology. Epistemology is theory of knowledge. By what theory of religious knowledge did you learn this? What defines our concept of God? What governs our concept of God and what we say about Him? What justifies our claims about God? When we speak of God, do we rely on human imagination and speculation? Of course not. Only God can tell us what He is like. And so we must turn to the self-revelation of God Himself. And so those who propose theistic evolution must be asked how they warrant this idea they have about God. How do they justify saying God providentially controlled the physical process by which man evolved from lower animal forms? If they are being arbitrary in saying that, then what they're saying is not reasonable. Arbitrariness cannot be accepted as a foundation. It's not reasonable. And of course, if they're arbitrary, then their theory is reversible. I can arbitrarily say, no, it didn't happen that way. And when they say, why not? I say, I don't need a reason any more than you do. So arbitrariness isn't going to be helpful. Only God could tell us with authority what He is like and what He does supernaturally. So when we turn away from speculation and arbitrariness to revelation, we turn to the teaching of God's Word in the Bible. What I would contend is we find no justification for theistic evolution, but rather a creation of God's work which stands in conflict with the notion of theistic evolution. In terms of literary honesty, that is, using the same rules of interpretation we would apply to other pieces of literature, whether we're interpreting Plato or Shakespeare or Will Durant. Using literary honesty, there is no way in the world to reconcile the biblical account of creation and later statements about creation in the Bible with the modus operandi of evolutionary theory. You cannot hermeneutically bring the Bible into line with theistic evolution. Why is that? Well, we read in the book of Genesis that when God created things, He did so in 6 days. We'll come to the 6 days in just a moment. The point is, the description given in the book of Genesis is the description of a mature creation. When God created on the 6 successive days, He made things in their mature form. The Bible does not say He made the prototypes and then they developed, that He planted the seed and then they grew. It says He created the plant forms and the animal forms and man in their mature state. That's the way it's presented. You have the freedom, intellectually, to reject that, to say, no, I don't believe that's true. You do not have the freedom to say that is not what the Bible says. It speaks of mature creations in 6 successive days. Moreover, those things created are created after their kind. God has built into the created order this structure of different kinds, different species. What's the origin of species? The biblical answer is God. He's the one who created the species lines so that things would develop after their kind. Thirdly, what the Bible says about the days of creation will not allow for the millions and billions of years needed for evolution to take place. And that's because the Bible says that everything was created in 6 days. That is 6 sequence of light and darkness. With respect to these days, the Bible says there was morning and evening, a second day. Morning and evening. Now you know that the standard answer to this offered by theistic evolutionists is, well, the days of Genesis are long periods of time. Like we speak of the day of Shakespeare, we don't mean one 24-hour day, we mean that period of time. And we might speak of the day of the Roman Empire, a long period of time. But you know what? When we speak of days as long periods, we never say there was morning and evening, and it was a day. That morning-evening sequence tells you that in the language of Genesis, it was intended as what, I'm not going to get out a stopwatch and worry about right down to the second, but what we would call basically a 24-hour day. Moreover, in Hebrew, you will find, if you do a study in the Bible, Though the word day can apply to a period of time, it never applies to a long period of time when an ordinal adjective is attached to it. That is, when some numerical qualification is given, first, second, third, fourth. Always, first day, second day, third day means 24-hour day. You don't have first long geological period, second long geological period. The word day is not used that way when it is qualified with numerical or ordinal adjectives. Moreover, in Exodus 20, verse 11, God gives the background for the Sabbath commandment, why it is we're supposed to rest on a weekly basis for 24 hours a day, is because in 6 days he made the heavens and the earth and rested on the seventh. Just think what that would mean if God used long geological periods for those days. We get around to Sabbath rest, that means a long, long rest. Obviously, the pattern of the weekly Sabbath, 6 days and a day of rest, being the model, being modeled after the creation week, tells you the nature of the creation week as well. I'd like to quote something that you'll find in Ken Ham's book on evolution, dealing with its crumbling foundations. He says, Professor James Barr, before I quote this, I should tell you, Professor James Barr, perhaps, if he's not the most highly esteemed Hebrew scholar in the world, he's in the top 3. Anybody would tell you that. And he's not a fundamentalist. He's not somebody that I theologically have a real high regard for. But as a semanticist and as a Hebrew scholar, he is first rate, top shelf, front burner. This guy cooks. He knows his stuff. Professor James Barr, a renowned Hebrew scholar and Oriel professor of the interpretation of Scripture at Oxford University, said in a personal letter, April 23, 1984, writing to Ken Ham, and I quote, so this is now Barr being quoted as he wrote to Ken Ham. So far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers the idea that creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. Now, I want you to understand, he's not saying all Hebrew scholars believe that it's true, but all Hebrew scholars believe that's what the language means. Let me say it again. So far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers the idea that creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. When someone comes along and proposes theistic evolution, the first question is, you don't have the right to speak for God by speculation. God then must have told you. When we go to God's Word, can we make the text of Scripture coordinate, harmonize with theistic evolution? And the answer is, no, we cannot, unless you think evolution took place in 6 24-hour days. More importantly, when we read the Bible, we see that man's origin is described in the Bible as distinctive from the animals. You cannot not only can these other problems not be reconciled with theistic evolution, man was created with the words, let us. God, the Holy Trinity, speaking, let us, through the special event, make man. All other animals were created according to a pattern, after their kind, after their kind, after their kind. And then in Genesis, when man is created, you would expect he's created after his kind, and he is. In the image of God created he them. Man's kind is not after the animals. Don't you see? Man is created after the image of God. And so you have this uniqueness about man, which you, again, even a person who doesn't believe it to be true, who is sensitive to literary analysis, can catch that. The author of Genesis set man's creation apart from the animals. And there's a unique procedure described metaphorically here. God forms man from the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and man becomes a living soul. It doesn't say he receives a living soul, remember. He becomes a living soul. Man is formed and inbreathed by God. No other animal has that kind of thing said of it. So man is distinct from the animals. He is the image of God. Man's life has a particularly sacred character. No animal proves to be a suitable counterpart to man. So God creates Eve to be the counterpart to man. Man names the animals. The animals don't name man. There's an enormous chasm then between man and the animals. But the Bible says there is no enormous chasm between man and God. You know how we know that? Psalm 8. What is man that you should consider him? You have made him just a little lower than God. Man is not, you see, just the final push up from the evolutionary procedure in animals. He's not just a little more than the animals. He's a little less than God. Well, there's one final way out. And with this, we'll end tonight. Theistic evolutionists might say, no, I can make the Bible fit into theistic evolution. I can overlook all of the problems. I don't know how you would answer them. Take care of all those problems. And what I would suggest is, when the Bible says God formed man from the dust of the ground, that was a poetic way of saying God used man, God brought man about through evolution from the lower creation. From the dust of the ground, God brings forth man. Remember, that's poetry, that's metaphor. Maybe that's a metaphor for evolution. From the lower creation, dust, to the higher creation, man. And then after a period of evolution and formation, then God breathes the breath of life into him. What you have then is man, who I guess was previously lifeless. No, it would have to be soulless. And so then God gave man that was a living creature a soul. Well now, can you do that from a literary standpoint? Is it true that this development from the dust of the ground was lifeless? No, the Bible says God breathed the breath of life into it. And not God imparted a soul, but man became a living soul. It's talking about one procedure is what I'm getting at. Moreover, if the dust here refers to the lower animal creation from which God providentially has man evolved, then we've got a real problem. Because in Genesis 3:19, God says, "From dust you came, and to dust you shall return." If we are to interpret the dust here as living dust, the lower animal forms from which man evolved, then man's return to dust at death must mean that he devolves. And so people don't really die. They just kind of become apes and then on down to amoebas. From dust you came, to dust you shall return. And with that reductio, hope that we finally dusted off the spot where the theistic evolutionist once stood. Evolution cannot stand. It is not a scientific theory. Evolution requires incredible, almost insane faith in a chance universe doing wondrous things. Evolution cannot be squared with the known principles of science. And theistic evolution will not save it, because theistic evolution cannot be squared with the teaching of God's own self-revelation. Let's take a break.
Do you want to go ahead and take questions?
Yes, I think it'd be a good idea.
News.